I will never forget the strange feeling I experienced in the moments before we descended. We stood near a massive abandoned building on the outskirts of a small town, famous for its underground passages, catacombs sprawling beneath its streets. The place was shrouded in twilight and history. I had been told that under these grounds once lay secret wartime storages, later repurposed as bomb shelters. Over time, parts of the tunnels collapsed, and the remaining ones gradually became wrapped in legends and eerie rumors. But this time, the rumors were disturbingly real. Locals had started to disappear, and whispers of a monstrous, wolf-like creature lurking deep within these corridors began to spread. We arrived here in response to an urgent call. The town authorities, alarmed by the series of disappearances, had requested military assistance. Our small Special Forces unit was tasked with entering the catacombs and uncovering the truth. No one knew for sure what we would encounter, but persistent rumors suggested that alongside the missing individuals, people in black robes had been seen performing strange rituals. Essentially, we were to investigate the existence of a cult calling themselves the Servants of the Wolf God. It sounded insane, but in military operations it wasn't uncommon for extremists to hide behind bizarre cults to justify their violence. We were prepared to find anything: illegal weapons caches, drugs, or underground labs. Yet, the local descriptions left an unsettling feeling. They spoke of howls, guttural growls, and large shadows gliding across the night streets. Our commander unfolded old, faded maps of the underground communication networks. Many sections were marked: unsafe, collapsed, flooded. We knew the route would require caution, using night vision and all available equipment. The pitch-black tunnels, devoid of electricity, demanded discipline. Panic had no place here, for death could lurk around any corner, whether from a collapsing ceiling or, as warned, a sniper's bullet from hiding fanatics. We prepared for the entry meticulously. Weapons were checked, suppressors securely mounted. Flashbang grenades were packed, and additional ammunition was left in the vehicle parked at the edge of the park. The weather was cold and damp, with crooked trees creaking in the wind. Everything around us felt grim. A gray sky overhead, the dark silhouettes of the old quarter that locals avoided at night. Even though the clock read early, we all felt as if the sun had set for us on this day. Soon, we began the operation. With a simple gesture from the commander, I stepped into the abandoned structure. Inside one of the rooms resembling a basement, we discovered a massive iron door leading into the catacombs. Assessing the visibility, we activated our night vision devices. In their dim green glow, the walls seemed to come alive. Scratches, scorch marks, and strange symbols etched into the bricks. My heart raced as the oppressive atmosphere seemed to warn, "You are not welcome here." We spread out in a single file and began advancing slowly. The operation was covert, no loud commands or unnecessary chatter. Only the muted thud of our boots and the ringing silence surrounded us. The darkness enveloped us, and the night vision distorted distances, making the walls seem closer. But there was no choice. Dozens of people had vanished in these damp corridors, and if we didn't find the cause, the disappearances would only continue. At first we saw nothing but lifeless corridors and piles of debris. It looked like a typical abandoned underground maze: rusted pipes, twisted metal bars, remnants of old brickwork. It seemed as though no living soul had been here for centuries. Yet if you stopped to sense it, you'd feel like someone was watching from the dark corners. Soon we came across strange symbols on the walls. They didn't resemble typical graffiti or military markings. Intricate patterns drawn with red paint, or something thick, perhaps blood. Thin lines intertwined to form figures resembling wolf-like faces. The night vision devices made the sight even more sinister. The commander silently signaled us to keep moving. There was no need to explain that these corridors weren't just passageways, but the true domain of the cultists. The deeper we ventured, the more we felt an oppressive weight. The sensation that an ambush could be waiting around every turn was impossible to shake. A faint draft from ventilation shafts howled, amplifying our fears. At times, I thought I heard distant creaks and rustles like the footsteps of an animal. It was some time before we came across the first serious evidence: remains of several people, likely fanatics. Their bodies lay in unnatural poses, flesh torn apart, their tattered clothing soaked with dried blood that stained the cold stone floor in dark patches. Examining one of the bodies revealed deep gouges, left by what appeared to be teeth or claws, crisscrossing the chest and neck. It was as if these unfortunate souls had been struck by something of monstrous strength. Looking at the victims, I felt a wave of fear rise within me, suppressed only by military discipline. The savagery inflicted on these people was inhuman. Yes, they might have been murderers, abducting innocents for their rituals, but what I saw spoke of power far beyond anything ordinary or rational. I tried not to dwell on the likelihood of encountering a massive wolf-like creature beneath these arches, something that, if the villagers were to be believed, stood on hind legs and possessed a terrifying intelligence. Yet the tracks we found, paw prints resembling those of a wolf, only far larger, clearly indicated a predator that neither fragile walls nor human resolve could contain. We continued forward, and before long we began hearing distant howls and strange moaning sounds. Whether it was echoes distorted by the tunnel's architecture or the ghostly cries of the wind, the noises sent chills down our spines. There was something too real, too sinister in those sounds. Gradually, I felt the walls pressing in on me, the air growing heavier, and a sense of dread blooming in my chest, as if warning me, "Turn back. You are walking toward your doom." But our orders remained unchanged. Uncover the truth. We couldn't simply turn back and report that we'd heard a few unsettling noises. Rounding a corner, we came upon a long, narrow corridor stretching ahead. Faint signs glowed on the walls, old warnings in faded English, partially plastered over. Suddenly, we heard footsteps and blocked the corridor. I glimpsed several figures flickering in the beam of one of our flashlights. They were armed. The figures scattered immediately and opened fire, giving us no time to think. Bullets whizzed past, striking the stone walls with sharp sparks. We acted swiftly and efficiently, communicating only through hand signals and quick movements. I darted to the nearest cover, vaulting over a fallen beam, and pressed myself to the ground. A teammate covering me unleashed a short burst, trying to pin the enemies to the wall. The winding corridor served them well as cover, but our position wasn't bad either. The skirmish erupted with unexpected ferocity. Through the night, vision's eerie glow, I could make out the fanatics wearing masks or hoods. Their attire was more militaristic than I had expected from mere cultists. One managed to fire back, and a bullet hissed past my head, embedding itself in the concrete behind me. My heart pounded furiously, but I knew panic would only worsen the situation. We launched several flashbang grenades to disorient them. I leaped from my cover, moving in short bursts and firing a series of shots to flush them out of the corridor. Eventually, their resistance weakened noticeably. A few bodies in dark hoods lay on the floor, shadowy silhouettes. I thought I saw 2 of them escape into a side passage. Following our commander's signal, we pursued them, but only managed to capture a wounded fanatic. Bleeding heavily and unable to resist, he muttered strange words, barely conscious. I heard him repeat something like, "the wolf." It took purified, and something else about blood. It was clear this man referred to the wolf or wolf god we'd already heard about. We didn't linger long with the injured man. The commander decided to press forward, unwilling to give the cultists time to regroup or set a trap. The fanatic's ramblings offered no new insights beyond confirming what we already feared. Somewhere in the depths of these catacombs, a creature roamed. Leaving the injured man behind, he and the other bodies would be dealt with later by a cleanup team, we moved toward the broader tunnels where the cult's main hideout was believed to be. These corridors were wider, with chains and rings on the walls, as though they once held animals or prisoners. We moved cautiously, sweeping our weapons across the area. In such labyrinths, an attack could come at any moment, and a misplaced shot might trigger a collapse. Judging by the remnants of the structure, this had once been a massive storage area, later converted into a bomb shelter. But now it was abandoned, marked with bloody symbols and runic signs reminiscent of an ancient cult. As we ventured deeper, we suddenly heard a sound, a guttural growl. It faintly resembled the low rumble of a massive dog and came from somewhere to the left of the corridor. We braced ourselves, but in the next instant, the darkness ahead erupted with sudden movement. An enormous figure darting toward one of our positions. Before we could react, the silence returned, but in its place we found signs of the missing. Or rather, we found no bodies, only discarded weapons and large smears of blood on the walls. 2 of our soldiers had vanished almost silently, as if a shadow had snatched them into the impenetrable darkness. Inside, it felt like everything collapsed. It couldn't have happened so quickly. Trained, alert operatives vanishing without a sound. But when I saw the blood and heard the faint, eerie noise reminiscent of a soft howl, I began to understand. We were up against something that moved through this place as if it were its lair. I noticed the rest of the team becoming increasingly tense, though fear was undeniable. I saw someone clutching the grip of their weapon tightly, holding it closer to their chest, their knuckles white. We soon stumbled upon what could only be described as a camp of the fanatics. I couldn't find another word for it. Small side chambers had been converted into cages, likely used to hold abducted victims, as tattered clothing and bloodstains littered the floors. At the center of the hall stood a crude altar, upon which lay raw flesh, glistening and foul. Surrounding it were candles and torches, most of them long extinguished. The stench was unbearable, a nauseating mix of decay, stagnant air, and the metallic tang of blood. The walls were covered with yet more ominous symbols, and among them were depictions of a wolf-like creature, its maw wide open and filled with human skulls. It seemed the fanatics were worshipping their god in this grotesque display. Even here we found the bodies of fanatics. They had clearly died recently, bearing the same horrific bite and claw marks. From what we'd seen so far, it was evident that the beast showed no distinction between prey and worshippers. We cautiously examined their belongings. Around one of the bodies were strange manuscripts written in a mix of Latin and unrecognizable symbols. Among the papers were stylized drawings of wolves and humans, intertwined in a predatory symphony. The picture became clearer. This cult had been trying to summon or awaken some ancient deity represented by the beast. It seemed like madness, yet the blood on the floor and the corpses around us confirmed that this madness had taken physical form. Meanwhile, our night vision devices started to malfunction. I noticed the screens flickering off for a few seconds before coming back, as if some strange interference was disrupting the power supply. Communication with the surface had also been lost. All we could hear in our headsets was the faint crackle of static. The commander signaled for us to keep moving, aiming for the central chamber, where we believed the source of all this horror might reside. We tried to inspect every passage and alcove, but the catacombs were vast, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only scratching the surface of a far more extensive network of tunnels. We encountered a few more living fanatics kneeling before a massive granite statue of a wolf. Their hands were raised, their voices rasping in a hoarse whisper as if they were praying in a trance, oblivious to our approaching unit. The statue was unnervingly lifelike. The sculptor had captured every sinew of the wolf's musculature with grotesque precision, and its eyes were inlaid with stones that glinted faintly in the pale glow of our night vision. As we moved forward, the fanatics suddenly raised their hands, grabbed weapons, and opened chaotic fire. One bullet ricocheted off the wall, grazing my shoulder. The pain was sharp, like a red-hot needle piercing through my uniform into my flesh. I staggered back, struggling to stay balanced, while my teammates unleashed a hail of return fire. The fanatics fell almost immediately, collapsing at the base of the statue. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with the musty air of the catacombs, and my head throbbed from the wound. During the skirmish, one of the dying fanatics managed to whisper something, pointing toward the depths of the chamber. He mumbled that their god had awakened and that no one could destroy it. We shot the lock off a massive door behind the statue and entered another chamber, an enormous hall resembling both a church and an ancient burial chamber. The vaulted ceilings disappeared into the darkness above, and the walls were adorned with murals depicting scenes of blood sacrifices. On the frescoes, a half-man, half-wolf figure tore into humans, lifting their heads toward the heavens as if offering them to some unfathomable force. With each step, I felt an unnatural cold, unlike the damp chill of underground air. It was as if the atmosphere here was charged with a sinister electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I moved forward cautiously, illuminating the chamber with my flashlight. What I saw defied description. From the shadows, a figure emerged, staring at us. It was roughly the size of a tall man, but with exaggerated muscles and a feral posture, its wolfish face twisted with rage, enormous fangs gleaming, and its eyes glowing eerily in the night vision. I couldn't look away. The creature embodied an unnatural combination of predatory grace and an almost human malevolence that was infinitely more terrifying. I raised my weapon and fired, but the beast, dogman as I began to call it in my mind, dodged with impossible speed and darted to the side, moving almost silently. The next few seconds stretched into eternity as we opened fire as a group, tracer rounds streaking through the dark. Yet the dogman seemed to sustain only superficial wounds. Bullets grazed its thick musculature or lodged harmlessly, failing to slow it down. The deafening roar of gunfire echoed under the vaulted ceiling, and the creature moved in an arc, seemingly flanking us. I caught its burning eyes in my peripheral vision. There was intelligence in them, not just blind animal fury. In a single explosive leap, the dogman lunged at one of our men. Even through the cacophony of gunfire, I heard the sickening crunch of breaking bones. My teammate barely had time to raise his arms before the creature slashed across his chest with razor-sharp claws. The rest of us began to retreat, knowing we had no chance in close combat. We threw flashbang grenades, hoping the creature couldn't endure the blinding flashes and thunderous noise. The chamber lit up in a searing white light, and the sound was deafening. For a moment the dogman froze, pressing its ears against its head before retreating into the dense shadows behind a stone column. We took the opportunity to pull back the injured man, but it was too late. He was already dead. That brief respite made it clear that our standard tactic of overwhelming firepower wouldn't work. The commander signaled for us to retreat into the corridor, intending to trap the creature in the chamber. Perhaps the narrow passage would give us the advantage, preventing it from flanking us. Quickly regrouping, we navigated the tunnels by instinct, keeping a tight perimeter. The dogman didn't immediately pursue. Instead, its guttural roar echoed from the depths of the chamber, accompanied by the sound of claws raking against stone. It felt as though the beast understood our plan and was biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This gave us a brief chance to reassess our options. We had wounded among us, communication remained dead, and our night vision devices continued to flicker with inexplicable interference. The commander seemed to decide that the only way to stop this creature was to collapse the part of the catacombs where it was lurking. Conventional weapons had little effect, which left us with no choice but to resort to extreme measures. We had several charges of explosives that could be placed along the structural walls, triggering a controlled collapse. It sounded drastic, but faced with the risk of releasing the monster onto the surface, we knew we had no choice. We returned to the chamber, executing a rapid demolition plan. The dogman, sensing our re-entry, burst out of the shadows almost immediately. This time it clearly wasn't going to let us leave. A deafening roar echoed through the chamber, flooding us with a wave of primal terror that chilled our blood. We split up. A few men began planting charges along the stone columns while the rest of us worked to distract the creature, firing at it from cover. I watched as the dogman circled the perimeter of the chamber, darting through the dim light with lightning speed. It would lunge forward occasionally, but we kept it at bay with flashbangs. The creature clearly suffered from the blinding flashes, but its rage only seemed to grow. With every explosion, it let out an almost human groan of frustration, which was somehow the most chilling part of it all. Finally, the charges were set. We had turned the ancient chamber with its altar into a powder keg, ready to collapse the underground temple and bury this monstrous wolf god forever. On command, we began withdrawing toward the corridor. I helped one of the injured, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the dogman to pounce from the shadows at any moment. And it did. Just as we were about to reach the exit, the creature made a desperate leap. The force of its movement sent a shockwave that nearly knocked me off my feet, a massive blur of muscle and fur. One of my teammates managed to turn and fire a short burst, hitting the dogman in the side. It roared in pain but retaliated instantly, slamming into the soldier. I saw its jaws clamp down on his arm, heard the sickening crunch of bone, and struggled to suppress the rising tide of panic. The rest of us concentrated our fire, forcing the dogman to retreat as our comrade writhed on the ground. It was too late for him. He was in shock, his arm reduced to a mangled mess. Still, we managed to drag him toward the exit, moving as though death itself were chasing us. In the corridor, one of the team prepared the detonator for the charges. We moved quickly, carrying the wounded as others covered our retreat, trying to keep the dogman at bay. It felt like the creature was clawing at the very stone, unwilling to let its prey escape. The commander gave the signal to detonate when we were at a safe distance. The explosion rocked the underground with a thunderous roar, and the ground above us seemed to shudder. The air filled with the screams of the wounded, the cascading rumble of collapsing stone, and the metallic screech of shattering supports. Dust and debris rained down on us, and the acrid stench of ancient decay intensified tenfold. The corridor walls began to crack ominously, threatening another collapse. We broke into a desperate sprint, dragging the injured soldier, shedding unnecessary gear to lighten the load and increase our chances of escape. Finally, we reached the exit. My chest burned from exertion and adrenaline, and my lungs fought against the choking stone dust. Outside, the gray twilight bathed the old building in an eerie half-light. We stumbled into the open air, dragging our wounded comrades with us. One was unconscious, barely clinging to life, his pulse faint. Another groaned in pain, clutching a badly injured leg. Outside, the cover team awaited us and immediately rushed to assist. I dropped to my knees in the snow, utterly spent, gasping for breath. The commander delivered a terse report. The catacombs were partially collapsed, the cult destroyed, but no definitive confirmation about the monster could be made. Based on our estimates, the dogman was buried beneath the rubble along with its altar and victims. No one could say for sure if it had survived, but given the scale of the explosion, its chances seemed slim. And yet, a gnawing feeling lingered inside me that things weren't so simple. I couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent, burning eyes staring back at me through the night vision. Later, we learned that nearly half our team had either perished or been severely injured. Officially, the operation was deemed a success. The town freed from the cult, numerous disappearances resolved, though the true horror of those disappearances was never mentioned in the reports. The commander's written account scrubbed all supernatural elements, framing the dogman as merely a highly dangerous adversary and the mission as one of extreme threat mitigation. The military, I had come to learn, didn't deal in mysticism. It dealt in sanitized facts, no matter how skewed. Days passed as we recovered from the ordeal, nursing both physical and psychological wounds. But time did little to erase the images seared into my mind. The shredded bodies of the cultists, the oppressive stench of the dark chamber, and the growling creature. At night, I often dreamed of wandering the catacombs again, enveloped in pitch blackness, the echo of guttural sounds trailing behind me. I'd wake to see the faint pre-dawn light through my window, my chest tight with the memory of a nightmare that felt all too real. Story 2. I thought I had seen it all. Years in the special forces, countless deployments to hot zones, clashes with radicals, rescue operations. But until that fateful night spent in the endless sands, I couldn't have imagined the horrors that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Now I understand that it's not just people who can terrify you. Sometimes, nature itself becomes terrifying when something otherworldly takes root in it. Our unit was assigned a reconnaissance mission in a desert region. This was a scorched plain surrounded by mountains dotted with small settlements teetering on the edge of civilization and the wild unknown. Usually we operated under the cover of night to remain unseen and avoid the oppressive heat of the day. This time, however, the command demanded we work covertly both day and night. Perhaps the threat we were to uncover was more serious than I could have imagined. We arrived by helicopter early in the morning, landing on a makeshift airstrip carved directly into the sands. The hot wind lashed our faces and sand worked its way into every crevice of our gear. The glaring sun shrank our pupils to pinpricks. We were greeted by an officer in a plain uniform with no insignia. He briefly informed us that we'd proceed in 2 armored vehicles and an old supply truck. He warned us about the dangerous terrain, dunes capable of concealing an entire army. But the only real intel boiled down to this: unexplained disappearances are happening in the region. By special ops standards, our unit was small but elite. Each of us had faced enemies who called themselves masters of the desert, However, as we were told, the disappearances here weren't caused by gangs or smugglers. Locals spoke of a strange beast, a wolf or a hyena, though no one could describe it precisely. Authorities believed it to be a band of renegades, resorting to fear tactics and even preying on innocent travelers. Our mission was to scout several key points: an abandoned colonial-era fort and a tiny settlement called Alamu, buried among the dunes. By the end of the day, we had traversed rolling dunes and scorched plains. The dust was so thick it was hard to breathe even through filters. The sun's relentless heat burned into us, and I kept wiping sweat from my face. The landscape repeated itself. Yellow sands and rocks, with occasional boulders that looked as if some monstrous force had ripped them from the earth. I noticed that our commander, a man with a stone-cold expression and an icy stare, kept glancing at an old map, trying to reconcile it with the terrain. But it seemed even he wasn't entirely sure of our path. Our orders were vague. Survey the area, report the situation, and if the threat is confirmed, act according to protocol. By nightfall, we reached a literal oasis, a few dusty palm trees and a small puddle barely sufficient to refill our canteens. We made camp. My watch was first, so I took my position and peered through the night scope at the star-studded sky. The temperature had plummeted, and my city-trained nerves felt on edge in the vast, silent desert. Every gust of wind, every rustle of sand put me on high alert. I recalled the story about how the creature we were searching for tended to attack on moonlit nights. I immediately shook the thought off. We weren't here to believe in fairy tales. But as I sat there in the sand, far from civilization, thoughts of the supernatural began to creep into my mind. By morning, it was clear we had ventured far off familiar routes. Finally, a line of buildings appeared on the horizon, Alamu. It seemed to rise out of the sand, a village of low clay and stone structures reinforced with wooden planks and metal sheets. The streets were eerily empty, as if the place had been abandoned long ago. At first, I thought the entire population had fled this cursed spot, but as we ventured deeper, we encountered a few locals draped in traditional garments. They cast wary, frightened glances at us from beneath half-covered faces, as though we were harbingers of doom. They refused to speak and quickly vanished. We stopped by one of the walls, trying not to attract undue attention. The commander gestured for us to spread out and keep watch. No one wanted to enter the houses openly. Our orders were to gather intel first. As I stepped out of the armored vehicle, I noticed something peculiar about the air here. It was heavy, laden with the smell of rotting wood and something unidentifiable. Our instruments picked up minimal radio interference, which wasn't surprising. The desert often caused signal disruptions. It wasn't long before I saw something that erased any doubt about the strangeness of the situation. In a distant alley, the carcass of a goat, or maybe a small cow, lay torn to the bone. Flies swarmed over it, and the dried blood clearly indicated the attack had happened recently. I studied the tracks. Large paw prints leading out toward the edge of the village, as if the predator had dragged part of its kill into the sands. At that moment, I felt an unsettling sensation, as though someone or something was watching me. I turned around. Just white and reddish walls, no eyes staring back. The commander called us all to regroup. We decided to take over one of the abandoned houses on the outskirts and use it as a base for observation before making further moves. The place had enough space. Many homes in Alamu seemed either deserted or hastily abandoned. As we inspected several of them, we found signs. Dried blood stains on the floors, overturned furniture, It felt as though the inhabitants had been driven out by force, or had fled in sheer panic. Night fell quickly over the village. We hunkered down inside the walls, posting sentries on the roofs and by the windows. The local buildings were low, and their flat rooftops offered a limited view of the adjacent courtyards. The desert seemed to close in around Alamu, transforming it into a lonely island of life in an endless sea of sand. But I felt no sense of safety. Quite the opposite. The oppressive heat and silence bore down on my mind. I listened to the night wind threading through the narrow alleys, trying to ignore the growing unease. Strangely, despite our extensive combat experience, I felt more on edge than I ever had before. There were no sounds of bustling streets, no roar of vehicles, no conversations, just a stillness, as if time itself had frozen, yielding to something older than human words. Around midnight, we spotted movement at the edge of one of the village's outer streets. A dark figure either darted past the windows or knelt, sniffing at the ground. We were too far to make out details, but the silhouette resembled a hunched man. I moved in closer, carefully hopping across rooftops. It was risky, but we needed answers. When I got close enough to see clearly, I couldn't believe my eyes. The figure turned, and for a brief moment the moonlight illuminated something horrifying, a wolf-like face, but too elongated for an animal. Its body was twisted and hunched, as though black fur mixed with tattered scraps of clothing. The creature stared at me with eyes that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. I froze, barely breathing. Was this really a werewolf? A man-beast? My rational mind screamed that it was absurd, that we didn't believe in legends, but the sight before me shattered every logical thought. The creature let out a short growl or hiss before darting into a courtyard and vanishing down a narrow passage. I relayed our coordinates over the radio, but the transmission was filled with static, as if something was jamming it. We quickly realized we needed to regroup. Staying separated in a place like this was far too dangerous. The tension wasn't just mine. 2 of my comrades reported seeing movement on another street. It seemed this wasn't just one monster. There might be several. Under other circumstances, I would have dismissed such a notion as ridiculous. But the oppressive atmosphere of Alamu left no room for doubt. Something was happening here. Something beyond the bounds of normal reality. By morning, we realized some of our equipment was malfunctioning. Night vision devices flickered intermittently, and the radio only caught fragments of commands. It felt as though the very air was saturated with interference. We still clung to the hope of a rational explanation, perhaps underground metal deposits causing magnetic anomalies, or enemy jammers disrupting our signals. But remembering the creature's glowing eyes from the night before, I doubted this was merely technical. We decided to investigate the house where the supposed werewolf had taken refuge. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Doors half hanging from their frames, windows boarded up. Inside, the air was thick with shadows, pierced only by narrow beams of sunlight cutting through cracks in the walls. Dust and sand coated every surface. I moved cautiously, my weapon at the ready, scanning every corner. The floor bore claw marks gouged into the plaster. As we moved deeper into the house, the sharp, metallic scent of blood hit me. In one room, the walls and floor were spattered with dried blood, and among the debris of shattered furniture lay fragments of human clothing. I didn't want to think about what had happened to the house's occupants. What unsettled me most was the massive wooden table in the center of the room, covered with pots of unknown contents. The stench of decay wafted from them. In the corner, ritualistic items lay scattered, amulets and animal figures carved from wood. Strange symbols had been burned into the walls, Everything about the scene screamed that occult practices had taken place here. I felt a growing dread. Could the villagers themselves be connected to the werewolf, feeding it victims, conducting rituals together? Yet no one was here now, only silence and the faint shafts of sunlight streaming through the broken ceiling. The day was scorching. I stepped outside, squinting against the blinding sunlight. The rest of the squad had finished searching nearby houses and reported finding similar signs of bloody violence. Some of them looked on the verge of breaking down. I understood. We were here to gather intelligence, but what we faced felt more like a curse than a military threat. Our orders, however, remained clear. Identify the source of the danger and eliminate it if possible. We had faced brutal gangs before, but my instincts screamed this was different. By evening, it was clear staying within Alamu was too dangerous. We decided to hold a perimeter outside the village near our armored vehicles and observe from there. That day, not a single villager approached us. It was as if they had vanished into the sands, leaving behind alleys haunted by werewolves, impervious to the desert heat. I began to wonder, if these creatures could truly change shape, could they blend in with ordinary people by day and revert to beasts by night? It sounded insane, but I had no better explanation. That night, our equipment nearly gave out entirely. We set up an ambush, rigging night vision devices to backup batteries and posting sentries by the vehicles. The darkness was so complete, it felt like someone had plucked the moon from the sky. I sat in the cabin of one of the vehicles, straining to hear any sound outside. The silence weighed heavier than a firefight. Suddenly, around midnight, a distant howl broke the quiet. It sounded like a wolf, but deeper, more drawn out. Too unnatural to be a mere animal. It seemed to rise from the depths of the night itself, freezing the blood in my veins. Dusty windows began to rattle from an eerie gust of wind. Moments later, gunfire erupted from the direction of the village. I jumped out of the vehicle, gripping my weapon tightly. 5 of my comrades were already running toward the noise. 2 soldiers stationed on watch had gone to investigate movement near one of the houses, only to be attacked by a massive beast. In the dim light, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a blurred figure, half human, half giant wolf, that had knocked one of them to the ground with a single leap. The other soldier managed to fire a burst from his rifle, but it was unclear if he hit the target. The creature moved with inhuman speed, vanishing into a nearby alley before anyone could react. We rushed over but arrived only to see our comrade lying in the sand, blood seeping from a deep chest wound. He was breathing, but barely conscious, and the injury looked as if it had been inflicted by enormous claws. Dark, sticky blood pooled around him, soaking into the sand. The commander knelt over the wounded soldier, barking silent orders with hand signals for the others to secure the perimeter. 2 medics began administering first aid while I scanned the darkness, straining to catch a glint of those eyes. I felt like any second now, it might lunge at us again. No one knew how to fight against such a force. A burst of automatic fire delivered at point-blank range had done nothing to stop the creature. The only logical choice was to retreat, report the situation to command, and request backup. But communication was nearly non-existent. The commander fiddled with the portable radio, only to hear static. It became clear that survival was now our priority. Completing the mission had to come second. We loaded the injured man into one of the vehicles and set off west, away from Alamu. The night was windy. Sand lashed against the windshield, cutting visibility to nearly zero. Our destination was the old Colonial fort we'd been ordered to investigate. Initially suspected to be a smuggler's hideout, it now loomed in our minds as either a refuge from the horrors or their source. The journey took hours. The feeling of being watched never left me. I scanned the shifting dunes, imagining that somewhere out there, in the shadows between the crests, the creature was stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We pushed the vehicles to their limits, desperate to get the injured man to safety before sunrise. Through the crackling interference on the radio, I caught fragments of a transmission from the base, urging us to return to the extraction point immediately. But the message was too garbled to be sure, and the commander insisted we check the fort first, perhaps still hoping to find help there. When the stone walls of the fort finally emerged from the sandy plains, my breath caught in my throat. Crumbling towers and weathered battlements rose like silent sentinels, holding secrets older than any of us. Dark, empty loopholes stared down at us like hollow eyes. The air seemed heavier here, laden with an unexplainable pressure, as though the ground itself bore the weight of blood and suffering from centuries past. It might have been my imagination, but everyone else seemed unnaturally quiet, as if sensing we were stepping into a den of danger. We split into two groups. One stayed with the vehicles to guard the injured man, while the rest of us, myself included, ventured inside. Part of the wall had collapsed, allowing us to slip through into the courtyard, a wide expanse filled with sand and rubble. In the center stood a dry well, near which lay a rusted Colonial cannon mount, half buried in the dirt. The decay of time had camouflaged everything, leaving little of interest. Except the tracks. I spotted fresh footprints. Some were human, possibly barefoot, while others were deep and clawed, unmistakably beast-like. Following the trail cautiously, we moved deeper into the structure, flashlights slicing through the oppressive gloom. The walls bore faded carvings and rusting nails, relics of an era long gone. As we approached a narrow corridor leading to what had once been the barracks, the air grew colder. My flashlight revealed a dark smear on the wall. Touching it with my gloved hand, I confirmed it was blood, still wet. A faint scraping noise echoed ahead, like claws dragging across stone. My breath caught as I froze, waiting for something to leap from the shadows. But the sound faded into silence. The commander gestured for us to check the side rooms. Step by step, we methodically searched, but the entire place felt like a trap, pulling us deeper into its labyrinthine corridors. In one of the larger rooms, we discovered a stockpile of dark crates and barrels, remnants of what might have been a smuggling operation. The area was coated in claw marks and strange grooves, as if a massive beast had dragged its weight across the stone floor. Before we could investigate further, a blood-curdling scream echoed from a nearby corridor. We rushed to find one of our soldiers on the ground, his leg slashed open and bleeding profusely. Standing over him was a nightmarish figure, part human, part beast. Its fur was matted and clumped with dirt, its twisted face a grotesque amalgamation of a wolf and a man. A werewolf? A beast? No description could do justice to the terror it evoked. We opened fire. The cacophony of gunshots roared in the confined space, our bullets striking walls and ricocheting in sparks. The creature howled, a sound that sent chills down my spine, before leaping toward the wall and vanishing into the darkness of another corridor. Grabbing the injured soldier, we dragged him back toward the entrance. His leg was mangled, blood soaking through his shredded pants. The terror in his eyes mirrored my own. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to leave this cursed place behind, but we couldn't abandon the others. There were too few of us left to risk exploring further. The commander gave the order. We needed to leave immediately. I exhaled in relief, Staying until nightfall would mean certain death. Navigating the shadowy corridors, we finally emerged into the courtyard. But as we reached the vehicles, gunfire and screams erupted from outside the walls. The second group, the one guarding the cars, had come under attack. We bolted through the crumbling archway, expecting the worst. The sight that met us was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. One of the vehicles had been dragged away from the entrance, while the mangled bodies of 2 soldiers lay scattered across the sand, torn apart as if by monstrous hands. The remaining troops were engaged in a desperate firefight, their bullets aimed at something darting between the rubble. Summoning every ounce of courage, I dashed toward the nearest cover, firing to provide support. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of the creature crouching behind a boulder. Its silhouette was unmistakably inhuman. Limbs too long, black fur gleaming faintly, and an unnatural stance on oddly bent legs. What caught my attention most was what it clutched in its clawed hand, a bloodied scrap of fabric, perhaps torn from one of our comrades. We kept firing, focusing on the shape. A few rounds seemed to hit their mark. The creature howled, jerking back, but it still managed to crawl behind cover and disappear into the breach of a crumbling wall. There was no time to think. We scrambled to the vehicles. One was barely functional, its engine groaning as we tried to start it. After a few agonizing attempts, the starter caught, and the engine roared to life. One of our team members shouted that the wounded man wouldn't survive without immediate medical attention. He was convulsing, his eyes vacant. Unable to provide advanced care, we resorted to basic first aid, pressing against his bleeding wounds. We crammed the injured into the one working vehicle. The commander motioned for the rest of us to pile in, abandoning the second vehicle. It was too damaged to move, with a shredded wheel and a ruined engine. I leapt onto the back seat, my heart pounding like a drum. The vehicle lurched forward, accelerating as we struggled to escape. Sand and debris slowed our progress, but the walls of the fort soon gave way to the endless dunes. I kept my eyes glued to the window, expecting those things to emerge from the ruins in pursuit. But there was nothing. Just collapsing walls and clouds of sand swirling in the wind. We tore through the breach in the fort's perimeter and into the open desert. The dunes stretched endlessly before us, the vehicle groaning as it climbed and slid down the shifting sands. Every moment away from that cursed place felt like a small victory, but guilt gnawed at me. We'd left behind unburied comrades and a wrecked vehicle. There had been no choice. Those creatures, or whatever they were, had the upper hand. And if there were more of them, a whole pack, we didn't stand a chance. The rest of the night was a blur of frantic driving. Our night vision devices malfunctioned intermittently, and the shaky GPS lost signal more often than not. Somewhere to the north, we hoped to find the evacuation point where we could request reinforcement. But the desert seemed determined to trap us. Every turn revealed the same scene: dunes, rocks, and swirling dust. Occasionally, I thought I saw a dark figure in the distance, running alongside us. But when I focused, it was gone, or perhaps hiding among the dunes. At dawn, it became clear that the wounded wouldn't all make it. One of them succumbed before sunrise, slipping away in silence. We stopped to bury him in the sand, wrapping his body in a cloak. The moment was unbearable. A faint morning breeze stirred the air, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and blood. The burial took only a few minutes, everyone silent except the commander, who bowed his head briefly in respect. We moved on, grim and resigned. The mission no longer mattered. Survival was our only goal. But the desert wouldn't let us go. By midday, the temperature had climbed to an unbearable 45 degrees Celsius. Our water supplies were dangerously low, and every hour drained our energy further. I began to fear we'd die of thirst and exhaustion before reaching safety. Then, on the horizon, we saw structures, a faint outline of what looked like another settlement. A mirage, perhaps, but the commander decided it was worth the risk. We steered toward it, despite the nagging feeling that it might be another trap. As we approached, the settlement came into focus, a cluster of decrepit brick buildings, more like barracks than a village. The streets were eerily silent, the air heavy with tension. The buildings didn't appear ancient but seemed abandoned in a hurry. We stopped the vehicle just outside, reluctant to venture deeper. I volunteered to scout the nearest structures. Walking through the empty streets, the sound of sand crunching under my boots was deafening against the oppressive silence. The layout reminded me of Alamu, a few houses around a central well with sparse dying trees. Rounding one corner, I caught a whiff of something foul, a mix of sweat and decay. Turning the corner, I found the source, the mutilated carcass of a camel, its flesh shredded like the goat in Alamu. Fresh blood stained the ground, and the familiar clawed tracks surrounded the scene. My stomach churned as I hurried back toward the vehicle. That's when I noticed movement in a nearby window, a fleeting white silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Raising my weapon, I cautiously approached the house. The door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, the dim light barely reached the far walls. My flashlight illuminated the interior. Shadows danced across broken furniture and crumbling plaster. In one corner, I saw a figure, a young woman curled on the floor. She appeared to be a local, emaciated and weak. Her face was contorted with pain, her cracked lips whispering soundlessly. She was too frail to move. I uncapped my canteen and dribbled water onto her lips. Slowly, she began to sip, her hands trembling. I knew protocol forbade contact with civilians, but I couldn't leave her like this. She trembled violently, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to pierce my soul. She tried to speak, gesturing frantically toward a shadowed corner of the room. I turned my flashlight in the direction she indicated. My blood ran cold. On the wall was a crude drawing, figures that were half human, half wolf, towering over sprawled bodies. Below them, strange symbols were scrawled in an unfamiliar script, like some dark incantation. The entire scene radiated malice, the air itself thick with an unshakable sense of dread. Behind me, a hand gripped my shoulder. I nearly fired on instinct, but it was one of my comrades. With a sharp gesture, he signaled that we were leaving immediately. The commander's orders. I cast a quick glance back at the woman. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Without another word, I bolted out of the house, the oppressive air pressing down on me as if the place itself were alive with danger. One of the soldiers was already waiting at the vehicle, reporting that strange noises had been heard just a few blocks away. Scraping sounds and what looked like the silhouette of a beast disappearing behind a fence. We didn't stay to confirm. Every fiber of my being screamed that the werewolf, or werewolves, would catch up to us if we delayed. The vehicle roared to life, its engine groaning under the strain. I clutched my weapon tightly, the sense of urgency mounting with every second. Finally, the radio crackled to life with a faint, fragmented signal. From the garbled transmission, I managed to piece together a critical message. Evacuation would be available at a designated point by sunrise. If we didn't make it, we'd be stranded. Dusk settled as we pushed onward. Our group had dwindled to 5 combat-ready soldiers, 2 of whom were severely wounded and in desperate need of medical attention. We followed an old map, eventually reaching a canyon, deep with sheer walls and a narrow path winding along the edge. This trail was our only shot at reaching the evacuation zone. As the sun disappeared, giving way to a cold, starry night, I switched on the night vision goggles, though they flickered with interference. The commander sat beside me, his breathing labored, a hastily bandaged wound on his chest. The heat of the day had faded, but the chill of the canyon brought little comfort. The path into the canyon was treacherous. The towering cliffs hemmed us in, leaving no room for maneuvering. To our left, a sheer drop plunged into blackness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. If the creature attacked here, we'd have nowhere to go. But staying in the open desert, with no water and dwindling supplies, would have been a death sentence. Suddenly, the vehicle jolted to a halt, its tires skidding. Up ahead, the lead truck had stopped as well. Its driver climbed out to investigate. Then came the scream, a guttural, bone-chilling cry. I leapt from the vehicle, my rifle at the ready, and saw the driver crumple to the ground. A shadowy figure had leapt from the cliffs above, landing on him with crushing force. The sickening sound of breaking bones echoed in the canyon. We opened fire, bullets tearing into the rocky walls, sparks flying as they ricocheted off stone. But the beast was too fast, too cunning. It darted between shadows, its growls reverberating off the cliffs. At one point, it skittered along the side of our armored vehicle, its claws screeching against the metal. In the beam of a flashlight, I caught a glimpse of it, a massive wolf-like head with bloodshot eyes gleaming with malice. It vanished just as quickly, melting into the darkness. The commander barked an order. Abandon the truck and load everyone into the remaining vehicle. One soldier attempted to provide cover fire but was struck down. I only saw the aftermath, his hand clutching his throat as blood poured through his fingers. The attack had been so swift I couldn't even process it. We piled into the remaining vehicle, the wounded dragged along as best we could. The tires skidded on loose gravel as we sped away, barely avoiding the edge of the canyon. The growl of the engine echoed in the narrow space, masking any sound of pursuit. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure stood atop the canyon wall, its outline twisted and wolf-like. It didn't jump, didn't chase. It just stood there, watching us with an expression, if such a thing was possible, of rage or disdain. A second later, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows. The remaining hours passed in a haze. We emerged from the canyon onto a plateau and continued toward the approximate coordinates of the evacuation zone. By dawn, we spotted the distant glint of helicopter blades cutting through the horizon. Relief swept over me, tears welling in my eyes. We had lost most of our team. Many had fallen at the canyon's edge or in the village. But those of us who survived had done so by sheer luck or fate. The helicopters swallowed us into their cargo bays, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. As we lifted off, I stared out the window at the endless sands below, their golden hues hiding secrets older than any of us. No one in the team doubted what we'd encountered: a werewolf, or an entire pack of them. Whether they were born of legend, science, or something else entirely didn't matter. What mattered was that they were real. Back at the base, we filed our reports. The official version pinned it all on highly skilled terrorists using psychological tactics and religious extremism. Any mention of the creature was erased, dismissed as hallucinations brought on by stress and dehydration. But no one could explain the bodies, mangled, torn apart by claws, their flesh shredded in ways no human weapon could replicate. Our reconnaissance mission had failed. No terrorists, no weapons caches, and no answers to the disappearances. Instead, we had glimpsed something lurking beyond the veil of reality, a force that had always prowled the sands, hidden in plain sight. If you're reading this, you might think I've lost my mind. Say what you will. I know the truth. I've seen the eyes of the beast, heard its guttural growls, felt the icy grip of its claws. This knowledge is my curse, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone.